Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us at the Toronto Real Asian Film Festival. Thank you so much for joining us on such a beautiful, gloomy, rainy day. We're just gonna get this audio up a little bit. But yeah, welcome to Real Ideas. This is a series of industry and film conversations hosted by the Toronto Real Asian Film Festival. My name is Samir. I'm the industry and education programmer here at the festival. Today's presentation is called From Concept to Reality, Creators Share Their Strategies for Documentaries, and we'll be joined by incredible producers and directors as they break down their journey of transforming a concept into a compelling finished project. So for anyone that's really interested in documentary filmmaking, for those who are perhaps making a documentary short or a documentary feature, we have incredible speakers who will be able to kind of fill in any gaps that you have, and you'll also have a chance to ask any questions. So throughout the conversations, think of any questions you have, and we will also be hosting a networking portion with free food and free drinks, and you'll have a chance to talk to each other, make some connections. At the festival, there's always people that meet future collaborators, future friends. I've made a lot of collaborators and friends here, and I hope you do too. And you'll also have a chance to speak to the speakers. Before we get started, I'd like to thank everyone who made this festival possible. This is from our staff to our committees and to our incredible volunteers. If you see our volunteers wearing the red t-shirt for any of our events, please say hi to them and thank them on your behalf. They do some incredible work. I also want to acknowledge that Real Asian's offices and main activities are located on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat nations. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Covenant. It's a treaty of collective responsibility for the protection and sharing of land, water, and resources. As storytellers and advocates for the arts and expression, we at Real Asian reckon openly with our responsibility to this land and its caretakers. We recognize that we are still in a time of great upheaval and need, that the dispossession of Indigenous communities and loss of their language and culture is not a thing of the past, but it is still ongoing. We're also a community-based charity, and we rely on donations from members like yourself to keep our yearly programming going on. Every year throughout the year, we host panel discussions, film screenings, and networking events. If you're so inclined, we'd love your donations, and you can make a donation at realasian.com/donate. We'd also like to thank our Real Ideas sponsors. This includes Warner Bros. Discovery Access Canada, IATSE 873, and Ontario Creates for their support in bringing our Real Ideas programming to you all. And we want to give a huge thank you to Doc Institute for partnering with us on this incredible panel discussion. It's been fantastic working with them, and this is our second or third year working with them, and we can't wait to continue this partnership. Lastly, we have a survey right over here. Please scan the QR code, fill in the survey, let us know your thoughts about this event, of any Real Ideas events that you've been to, or what kind of programming you'd like to see in the future. And if you do the survey, there's a chance for you to win a dinner for two plus a one-night hotel stay. So that's a pretty great gift. And yeah, fill it out, bring a friend, bring a parent, and hopefully you get the prize package. So I'm not going to introduce our incredible speakers. We have Yasmine. Yasmine is a Haitian-Canadian award-winning writer and director. Her first feature documentary film, One of Ours, premiered at Hot Docs in 2021 and won the Special Jury Prize and the Top 10 Audience Choice Award. It was also nominated for 3 Canadian Screen Awards for Best Writing, Best Directing, and Best Feature Documentary. Round of applause. That's amazing. We also have Shasha. Shasha is a storyteller whose work has taken her to the Hawaiian coastline. That's really nice. The ski slopes of Davos, also very nice. And the Nevada desert, a Cold War bunker, the engine room of a decaying ship, Philippine sugar mills, and the front lines of Nigeria's energy crisis. Her work has aired on the BBC, the CBC, the ZDF, and Art. Her work has screened at the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA. It's been nominated for 16 Canadian Screen Awards. That's fantastic. And named TIFF's Top 10. It was also shortlisted for an Oscar. And lastly, but not final, And we also have Soko, who will be joining us. Soko is a Toronto-based producer, dabbling in doc, scripted, podcast, and lots in between. Some things she's proud of are working on all 4 seasons of Netflix Emmy-winning Hip Hop Evolution. It's an incredible show. A production managing 2 barrier-breaking CBC Gem web series, which are called Next Stop and Lido TV, and producing a doc series about viral videos called Witness with Scarborough Pictures. And it premiered at Hot Docs and Doc NYC. She's currently in post-production on 2 feature films. Oh, actually, they already came out. There's Reza's highly anticipated talent to watch film, Box Cutter, and the award-winning director Amarwala Shook, which actually just premiered at TIFF earlier this year. And we had an incredible panel discussion about the film earlier at our festival. Please welcome the 3 panel speakers today.
Hello. Oh my God. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming, first of all. This is so special and cozy and just wonderful. So we are basically going to be self-moderating. So please have your questions ready. This can be a very kind of relaxed, casual conversation. But I'd love to start with I know both of you do so many different things, both in scripted and doc and short and writing and everything in between. What is your relationship with documentary right now? And is there anything that you're working on?
Oh, hello. Hello? Yeah? Okay. I guess I'll sort of backtrack. My entry into documentary is first from journalism. I did my master's in journalism at Ryerson, and I think that was a pretty foundational space for me to sort of understand how to tell a story. But yeah, as far as like documentary projects that I am working on right now, I'm working on a feature documentary which is in early development. And I'm also working on an animated short doc, which I feel like I've been working on for like so many years now. but it's a project about my parents. And so I find that anytime I'm working on a project that's really personal, it just takes a lot longer than I could ever anticipate. But I think the time ends up really lending itself to getting to the heart of things. Whereas I think when I'm working as a director for hire on a doc project, like I think sometimes it can move a lot faster. And then the financing structure of that is also like most often, I think for me anyway, it's been a bit faster than when you're like raising the funds and you're doing all the things. And so, yeah. What about you?
My relationship with documentary is complicated, yeah. I guess. Yeah. I too came into documentary through journalism. I went to journalism at TMU and have worked in primarily documentary for 15 years now, I would say, and I'm moving more now into the scripted space. But at the moment, I'm producing a feature doc by Kenya Jade Pinto that's in production called The Sandbox, and have a doc series in development as well. So hoping to work more in the scripted space, but I find myself continuously drawn to documentary, and I think I always will be. Yeah.
I'll just add that I have primarily worked, my entrance way is a little bit different. I've primarily worked kind of as a producer for hire or a PM for hire on people's projects in doc. And lately, the last couple of projects I am currently working on, one is a feature doc about an Indigenous hip hop artist, and another is which Anupa over here is also working on, and then another is a Nat Geo doc series that I don't know if I'm allowed to share much about it yet, but it's in early pre-pro right now, and we're going to be filming throughout the next several months. So yeah, I think it's also complicated. It's one of those things where like I've for the past couple of years, I've kind of focused on my kind of creative producing in the scripted world. But doc is always like my first love. And I feel like, you know, it kind of gets interwoven into my life with each year that goes by. Okay, so my second question is, how does a story typically find you? You know, when you are working on these projects, you know, are you kind of going out with an idea of something you want to document? Are people reaching out to you? What are some of the ways that some of your latest projects have found you?
I think for me, I feel like I never really, I guess, like actively go out to try to find a story to be a documentary. I think sometimes I find that I'll like meet somebody or hear of a story and just sort of, I guess, follow it and sit with it. And I feel like it's only if I'm like, I usually sit with the idea for a really long time. And if I can't shake it off, then I try to take steps to actually make it, because documentary asks a lot of you and a lot of your time. And so I think for me, like, I feel like, for example, even with my first feature with one of ours, I just didn't think that I was gonna make that film. I feel like I heard about what was happening. So for some context, one of ours is a story of a young boy who was, he was born in Haiti and he was adopted by an indigenous family out in Calgary. And in 2016, he was trying to play basketball at an all-indigenous basketball tournament, and they banned him on the basis of him not being indigenous enough. And so the film sort of asks questions around his identity and his belonging. And so for me, my entryway into that project was, I grew up in Calgary and I knew him, I knew his family, but we weren't like he was just like someone who was part of the Haitian community. Like my aunt, when I was 11, was like, hey, here's some kids, they're Haitian, go play. That was it. And so they were just like around, and so I never really thought much about their identities, all the political layers involved, because I was a kid growing up with them. And so the kernel of the film idea that kind of came in my head only happened after I saw, like years later, I still had them on Facebook. And when the news came out that he was banned from the all-native basketball tournament, I was now watching his name in a news headline. And I think the sort of the jarring thing of like knowing someone when you're a kid and then now seeing their name in the news just felt really intense. And then I reached out to the family, and then that's sort of like I wanted to sort of amplify their story. And I think the more I dug further, the more I think the idea of this being a film, I could see it in my head, but I didn't really approach them like fully with that intent until I sat with it a lot more. Because I think the reason why I feel like I tend to sit on things for a really long time before actually jumping in is because I'm always terrified. I don't know. I think there's a level of terror, and I think I don't know. I feel like if I don't feel that the terror of it, I don't know that it's worth it. In some weird, sick, twisted way, like I genuinely
We're all
think
crazy.
that I genuinely think that like, oh, like I don't know why, but that's sort of like a weird like vetting process that I have with me, is that if it feels like it's like, I don't know, then I feel like, okay, maybe. And then I have to just, I don't know, my gut just has to kind of tell me. And then you just move with the terror, and then you just hope that you'll be okay. And it's still kind of the same vetting process that I have with this current feature that I'm working on. And I was just telling them before we came on that I'm in the anxiety and terror part. Like I'm avoiding my participant right now when I know I should just like be active. But I think, yeah, I'll get out of that. But yeah. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, similar to Yaz in that definitely, I'm very careful and intentional about the documentary projects I take on. Again, because the energy investment versus the sustainability of it, so you have to really, really care about the projects, the doc projects that you work on. They often take years to make, but they've come from a lot of different places. Sometimes just my experiences or things that I wish I could watch. And then sometimes just really random things like meeting someone at a party in Berlin, and then they're really interesting, and then it turns into something. It comes from all over. But also, there's so many different places where story ideas come from, but they do have to go through a kind of interrogation process of, is this something I want to spend a lot of years on? Is this something I can financially take on? Can I bring something to the table? Am I the right person to tell it? All of those questions.
Yeah. I'll also add that, I think when you end up, if you're curious about an idea and then you're entertaining it as a possibility, I feel like one of the other questions that I go through is am I willing to sit with these people or questions for years? And if it's too much to think that it's gonna I'm gonna have to sit with these heavy questions for maybe sometimes 5+ years, then I do have to second guess whether or not it's worth it for me to take on. And sometimes it's maybe not right now. And then a few months down the line, I feel a lot more willing and present to be able to take it on. So yeah, just that.
I was kind of just thinking that I think it's a really underrated aspect of producing and directing is kind of that decisiveness and learning what your decision process looks like when you do say yes to a project, whether it's being pitched to you and you're kind of learning your own process of being able to spot red flags and being able to, just tell when a project is right for you, because, that will happen. And you kind of get better at knowing through trial and error, maybe even, what are the projects that actually sustain and that are worth going the long haul for yourself on a personal level. But yeah, I was even just thinking about how, Yaz and I worked on a doc series called Witness that kind of takes you into the stories behind people who have filmed viral videos and kind of what was the aftermath, what happened afterwards, after the video went viral. And there was one episode of that series that, and, I won't share what it was, but was surrounding a participant that was, such a fascinating, interesting story, but it needed more than just one episode. And it was going to take way longer than what we had scheduled. So we had to pivot for that series. But Yaz ended up continuing that relationship and is now working on a project.
Yeah. So it's one of the last things I worked on was Witness. And in that, I remember just really connecting with that participant. And I remember feeling super gutted that we couldn't go forward with that episode. And then I don't know, I had this feeling that there's way more to what she shared than what our show was able to explore. And then again, I sat with it for a year because I was like, nah, am I ready? Nah. and then eventually I think after a year of sitting with it, I decided to take steps towards trying to tell that story. And then that's kind of where I'm at now. So I feel like there's a web. Once you start making a project is through people, and then you end up connecting with other people through other projects, and they become ideas sometimes.
Mm-hmm. And you never know where it'll take you. It could turn into something else. Okay, so I have a kind of a bit of a practical question, but when you have the seed of an idea for a doc, what are kind of the practical steps that you start to take, maybe from, a director's point of view or a writer's point of view, in terms of drafting that story? Are you putting cue cards up on the wall? What's happening for you in your process?
It really depends on the project. The approach is different every single time, but part of that interrogation process I talked about is also kind of determining whether it needs to be a documentary, whether it needs to be animated, whether it's live action, is it a short, is it a feature? And part of that is assessing, like, is there enough story here? Do we have the access to the story that we need? Do we have access to the archival or the rights, the licensing that the project needs? Those are like the very first kind of questions. And then some initial research and if additional access is needed, getting that access. That's kind of like the first steps. Yeah.
Yeah, I think similar. I think I asked myself those questions too. But the other thing that I like to do is just try to just write the story on a piece of paper, just assuming that, like, okay, this is a story of this person and what's the conflict, and just writing out what that looks like on paper. And then that way, I think it helps me, like, for me, writing helps me get to what I want. Like, I think a lot of times I don't really know what I want until I start writing it. Other people might have different processes, but for me, it's like, it's very much writing heavy. And then and sometimes it could be something as simple as like throwing questions at a topic. So I'll put question marks on a sticky note and just like look at those questions often. And then somehow the story will sort of start kind of showing itself to me. But yeah.
I mean, I think it's a little bit different. I wanted to ask you that question because I know you both direct as well. But I think when I try to work with a director, oftentimes the projects that I've worked on were very like research heavy. So the research phase was kind of like a key part of the process into determining like, okay, who are the most interesting characters like here? What are the most kind of visually interesting aspects of the story to show? What's at the crux of this story? And I feel like a lot of it is through pre-interviews and pre-interviews and kind of like then going through and transcribing it and highlighting like what makes sense and kind of just putting together a bit of like a beat sheet. So yeah, I think, like you said, every project is so different depending on what it is, but that's generally been my process, especially with like the music doc world. Okay. What makes a successful partnership? There are many partnerships that we make in the doc world, whether it's directors and writers, directors and producers, director and editor. Those are all important relationships. I'm just curious from your experience if there's any kind of tips that you have or things that you look for in the other person for it to work really well for you.
I think it always depends on like the role of that potential collaborator in the partnership. But I think for the most part, I like to have a lot of conversations about the subject matter and maybe figure out like if the collaborator I'm working with has a connection to the subject matter. I love to have those kinds of discussions. Then I think I really enjoy when people also have like a personal connection to what we're trying to explore, because then it's easier to connect in that way. But I've also collaborated with people who don't have that same connection, but are able to at least find the sort of like human thread that they connect to. And so discussions, like having creative conversations around the story and what they can picture. And from those conversations, I find that I just kind of like use my gut. If those conversations feel like it's feeding to my imagination of the film, then I find that like that's a good metric of choosing someone. Other times, like it depends on the collaborator, but other times it's also like, do they know all these other things that I don't know? Right? Like, cause you're trying to find someone who's going to help support the production of your film. So, and that we don't all know everything. And so I like to also partner with people who know more than I do. And so just having those kind of conversations and then just trusting your gut.
Yeah, I think all of those things as well. Reciprocity and alignment, and like reciprocity can come in like so many different forms. People's strengths complementing others' weaknesses, vice versa. People bringing different things to the table. And then alignment in terms of like, are you aligned in the story that you want to tell? And like, do you have the same goals for the project? Like one person might just want to make a ton of money and make it fast. One person might want to change the world, but they don't care about making any money. Like, what are your goals? And similarly, like, are you in creative alignment? And if you're not, can you get there? Can everybody on the team like put their ego aside, like in service of the project? And I think those are the main things. Yeah. What about you, Soko?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that you both said. I think my first metric test is usually just vibes. I'm a very vibes person, vibes based. So I think that's sort of like, if you pass the vibe check, that's the initial kind of piece to it. And I think that includes a lot of what you said of like, having the same goals of, kind of working in a very holistic way. Like, I'm not here to just be, a workhorse for a project. Like, I also want to get to know you as a human being, and that's important to me. And then, yeah, I think sometimes it takes a lot of years, a lot of trial and error to find your people, and that's just the reality of it. And you have to do it through creating projects, working with as many people as you can. And you'll see that a lot in doc. Like, people will, once they find, that director person or that producer person or that editor person, they work with them on the next 5 projects together. And I think a lot of that you can do, as much homework and kind of research as you can, but a lot of it is just trial and error, and then like holding on to that person for dear life.
I also think that sometimes there's like stories that might require a particular partnership versus another. Like, for example, I think about how when I was making one of ours and I interviewed a lot of different cinematographers, and I remember knowing that I wanted to film the project a certain way. There were people's work that I loved, but I also needed to think about the spaces we were going to be in and what I would require of like how much space my cinematographer might take if they were able to sort of, be a bit discreet and that kind of thing. I think those things I think a lot about in choosing a collaborator like a DP. But yeah, I just feel like sometimes there's also like the story that sort of dictates who you end up going for. And it's not for lack of like the merit of the creative that you're having conversation with, but it's just what the story requires. But yeah.
Okay, so a little bit more about prep and production. Can each of you talk a little bit more about what exactly does the prep process look like for you, and kind of best practices during that prep phase?
Yeah, I think, when I'm starting to build out things like the budget and the schedule, one thing I think about kind of reaching for first is like, once you have a treatment and a bit of like a rough schedule, like knowing, okay, this is the fund that we're trying to apply for, or these are the parameters that we're trying to work within, or we're trying to like film around this event that is, time sensitive, all of those things being taken into consideration, and any kind of like general assumptions that you have about the project, I think are really important to kind of keep at the forefront while you're moving through the prep process. Whether it's like, how many interviews you plan to do, where you plan to, like, if there are 2 cities that you are non-negotiables that you need to visit in order to, capture this story in a fulsome way. And then when I kind of start thinking about the budget, I take all of those things and start to plug in. But I think they all become, especially during like the development and, early pre-pro process, they all become living, moving, breathing documents that change when the other changes. And I think they kind of do a little bit of a delicate dance.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think for me, it's also a lot of just digging into the research, whether it's like if I'm, for example, when we worked on Witness, it was just digging into a lot of like watching the video that they recorded, seeing if what the news reports were about that participant, and a big piece of it too is also just having pre-interviews, and so speaking to the participant and like before we go and film, so I can get a sense of like who they are, what's occupying them on their day to day. And if we're exploring a particular sort of story thread, getting a sense of what their memory of that story is, but getting into it, but not getting too much into it because you want to make sure that when you are going to do the like on camera master interview, that you're asking them questions that they know they haven't told you yet. Because I think, and that's kind of a delicate balance when you're doing like research and you're talking to your participant and you're prepping for like a master interview, sort of like having the space to be able to ask enough questions to get broad strokes around like how your participant might be throughout your story, but also leave enough mystery so that when you're doing the interview, you're actually curious about their answer and you're able to be a lot more granular with your questions, like when you're doing it for real. And so I think it's a lot of, it's just reading a lot and listening a lot and writing a lot. Yeah.
So is that me?
Oh no, I'll ask the next question actually. So we talked about prep. What does prep look like for each of you? I'd love to know more about actual production. Like, how do you go into production? What is your mindset like? What are some little best practices that you kind of take with you throughout the actual making of the thing? Which can look very different on different projects. You know, for some projects, it might be like, okay, you go to one location for 3 weeks and that's the doc. And then others, it's like, 3 years and 10 locations. And so, how do you move through that process as producers and directors?
That's a tough question. I think, well, I'll just share kind of like a general story that kind of comes to mind related to it. When we were working on Hip Hop Evolution, I remember waiting around. We had to wait around in New York for like a week just to get an interview with Mos Def, aka Yasmine Bey, and literally like we had to change around our whole schedule. It was supposed to be on the Monday. He like didn't show. We had to push it, and we had to keep like extending our stay and changing our flights just so we could like catch this 1 hour interview with like one artist, which is not a very financially sound way to live your documentary life. You know, you want to try and decrease the amount of time you're paying your entire crew to just kind of like sit and wait around. So that just kind of like, that's just one story from that doc. There are many stories like that from that doc series and many of the music docs I've worked on, where you're kind of like having to constantly adapt your schedule, whether it's your edit schedule, your filming schedule, to accommodate for both like, artists and creatives who maybe have unpredictable lives, but also just like regular people who maybe have, just challenges happening in their real life, and where you have to constantly adapt. So it just, it's always such a reminder when you're in the pre-production stage or you're in budgeting to give yourself so much leeway when it comes to schedule and money if you are working with folks who maybe are not just like always available and around whenever you need them.
Yeah. I feel like being adaptable is like such a major part of moving through production in a documentary, because you're inserting yourself in someone's life. And so you just have to be able to be like water. You know what I mean? Like really be able to move around their lives. Because in a lot of ways, the participants themselves are also trying to move around you. And you hope that you find some kind of like synergy that works for the both of you. But for the most part, that can also be really hard because you can have a plan for a shoot, but these are humans living their lives and things come up. And so, yeah, like be very much ready to drop what you were doing because the participants' welfare and what they need to do should take priority, as they should. But I think like, I think that can also be really hard when you have to sort of constantly be very malleable. And so I think the other big piece of moving through production is also making sure you have access to community, other folks that are doing documentary work to sort of air out like, hey, like this is what's happening, like to brainstorm maybe with your team of like other ways that you can kind of still tell the story without it being too jarring with the start and stop, you know? So I think that's like a big piece of it is also like carving that out for your production. And every film project has a different ask of you and ask of your team. So, but yeah, for like to protect your sanity as a director, I think like having a community, whether it's like building a relationship with your producer where you're able to sort of have those conversations, or finding other folks outside of your production team that you can kind of air out some of your frustrations or grievances is like a big piece of moving through it. Cause yeah, I mean, I think so much of it is like, it's like planning and surrender, but so much of it is so like unpredictable and you have to be ready. You have to be ready for it all.
I'm glad you both talked about the exact two things I thought about when I thought of production, which are endurance and agility. And those are like really the key things because, it's maintaining, doing the maximum level of prep that you absolutely can. And like, you know, walking this Google Street View of the location so you can see, okay, scout things and ahead of time, watching reference films, preparing interview questions, but then also being prepared to just completely blow up your production schedule and change the person that you're filming. You know, you just have to have that mix of preparation, but also the agility to pivot when you need to, and the endurance to just keep pushing because, of course, not every shoot day is going to be incredible. And it takes a long time to make feature docs, especially. So, yeah.
Yeah. Also, I would add that, like, I think as you're moving through production, you're also learning about your participants. And sometimes they tell you things that wasn't even on your map of ideas. And so I think a big part of directing docs, especially, is not only to just like stay focused to your vision, but also be very open and be like, and really listen to what your participants are actually sharing. Or sometimes it's what they're not sharing, you know? And because sometimes like they can like give you gold and you didn't expect it. And then it becomes the thing that really is the heartbeat of your project. But if you stay so like focused on the thing that you went to do the interview for, you might lose it. And so I think it's this mix of, again, like being prepared, but being so open, but like present with your participant, to like notice it and to like catch it.
Yeah. And so my last question here related to the production process specifically is like this mode of being like, coming in with intention, with prep, with a plan, and then also being open to completely change and tailoring the way you move to each individual situation and each individual person you come across is very unique to documentary. And both of you now also work in scripted. And I'm curious if you've completely changed your modalities as you move into scripted, or have you brought some of those doc things along as you move through scripted work too?
I think doc will just always be like so embedded in me. Like I can't even help it. Like I'll be in a scripted, like a dramatic feature set with like lots of people and I'm still like taking out the garbage and like just doing whatever needs to get done. Because that's just like that doc mentality where we are usually a very small team. You get to know each other. You're very close knit. And you kind of do everything. So I think I still very much have that approach. And sometimes like the people around me have to be like, okay, just like take it easy. Like you don't need to do all that. But yeah, I think there is something about that, which is like kind of nice too. It's like, there's not as much of maybe like a hierarchy, on doc sets, I feel. And it's kind of nice to kind of feel like we're all in it together. And if you need a hand, like I'll help you. Like if I need a hand, like you'll help me. And, I think just that kind of like small crew guerrilla mentality is like very much embedded to still my producing in unscripted projects, for better or for worse.
I think for me, I'm still sort of early days in that transition into fiction work, but I'm realizing, and I feel like as I am making my transition over to fiction, I used to feel a little bit like a lot of imposter syndrome. But I think what I've realized is like documentary sort of has taught me a lot about people and how to observe behavior and even like recognizing an emotion in somebody. And I think all these things are so fundamental to fiction. And so I think I'm now sort of allowing myself to own the fact that I know more than I think. But I think documentary specifically is so rich in helping you understand human behavior, and motives and even performance. Like when we're working with participants, we don't necessarily look at them as performers, but it's a form that requires you to look at performance. And so I think I'm now kind of rewatching things maybe slightly differently because I'm trying to learn this other mode of story. But also I'm realizing like there's so much parallels between the two because in so many ways in fiction is trying to always grasp for something real. So in some ways it's reaching for something that's kind of doc, but not. And so I think, yeah, I'm just kind of realizing that the two worlds are a lot closer than I thought. And yeah, I think that's what I'm learning so far.
Want to talk about...
Okay. So we'll move into post and marketing. Editing is an integral part of the doc process. What lessons have you learned in the edit room about filmmaking? Like, how did you navigate like getting notes?
How did I navigate getting notes? Well, interestingly, on a lot of the projects, okay, so editing, what lessons have you learned in the editing? I think editing for doc is actually where the film is really, really made, to be honest. You can go in with an intention and you can go in with a plan and you can go in with a structure even of what you think the documentary is going to be, but it's never really, really, really written until it's in the edit room. And I'm really lucky to like live with my partner, Rich, who's edited a lot of the films I've worked on together. And so it's been a very organic process. But one of the things with the edit is also learning to not impose a shape too early, impose structure too early, and to just let the material rise to the surface and let the editor bring their lens of what they see in the footage, because they might not know all the things that happen behind the scenes on the day when you were filming. They're coming in at it's really interesting. It's kind of pure that they're just seeing the footage and they're interpreting what is there. And so trying not to do that is a little hard, but it's important to learn to like step back and just let the material rise to the surface and then assess, oh, what do we have here? And let that happen organically. Yeah.
I want to add to that. I think the other piece of it, well, I guess to the question of how do you navigate notes? Yeah. I think notes are hard. When I was making one of ours, my editor, Young, was amazing. And then towards the tail end, we created this Google Doc, which was like, till this day, it gives me so much anxiety because that's basically where we would send different cuts to different people and they would send us notes. And then we would go on Zoom because for context, I edited my feature remotely and it was all via Zoom and online. So we had this Google Doc where we put every feedback. I still have it. I think it's like 52 pages long. And we would go through the notes and it was a lot of times it was painful. Most times it was painful. But also I think the edit was, I think looking at notes, what was helpful sometimes is realizing that sometimes there were like common threads in the feedback, which helped us kind of understand what was working in the edit and what wasn't. Other times it's just like having conversations with my editor to figure out what is the note behind the note. Because sometimes they'll like, someone would be like, we don't need this person over there. Like, why are we spending 5 minutes talking about shoes and blah, blah, blah. And then you realize like, oh, like they would understand that if we set up this part of the cut earlier, then the payoff of like sitting and talking about shoes makes more sense. And so I think notes are complicated, but I think a lot of times when you're able to sort of, especially if you have a great editor, working through them can really help us like find the story and find the moments that actually work. Yeah. And then also like you kind of have to also know which notes are crap and then which ones are just not relevant to your project. And sometimes it's they don't get the project and that's okay. It's just, maybe it's a project that's like not for them. So having the discernment to like know which notes to disregard and to like, fight for the vision you have. I think for me, especially as a director, that was a big lesson in making my first feature is deciphering through all the notes and deciding which ones we're gonna go to bat for, even if the feedback is like, we don't get this, we want this before. And then sticking to it, or at least like reworking the story so that you don't have to make that compromise. Yeah.
I think the only thing I'll add is it's okay if you want to cry after watching your rough cut. Yes. Like sometimes it all just needs to like happen and you might, all of your dreams and visions for something that you thought were, going to seem a certain way are not there yet. That's what the rough cut is for. It's there to kind of just be your first building block. And it'll get better. It should get better. Yeah.
So for marketing, what do you consider when starting to market and position a project? Like when do you start this part of the process?
I think, what can I add to this conversation? I think it's important to start thinking about positioning and marketing as early on in the process as possible. Even when you are developing, when you are in pre-pro, when you're on set, when you're capturing things. Like, I think positioning your project and packaging it is something that maybe sometimes gets kind of shafted to the side in your order of priorities. And then you're just like, okay, now we're done the film. Okay, now we have to think about like, where are we going to apply and what are we going to do with it? Whereas that should be an integral part of the process the entire time, because ultimately your goal is you want people to watch it and you want, your audience, your target audience to watch it and experience it. And if you aren't kind of constantly thinking about like, okay, what's, either the festival deadline that we want to apply for and how are we kind of like working our way towards that? Or, what kind of community engagement do we want to be doing as a part of the release? Or what kinds of like behind the scenes footage and, stories are we trying to also capture as we are building this thing so that when we launch, we have like all of these wonderful assets to build it out with. I think it's something that oftentimes due to budget and time and low capacity sometimes gets like, is a last minute thing, but it literally is a difference between, the people that you want to see your film seeing it or not seeing it a lot of the time.
Like Canadian filmmakers don't spend nearly enough money on marketing their films. And oftentimes like the marketing budget is like the first to get cut if a film's like going over. And then filmmakers are just like hoping that their distributor who has like 50 films will market their film for them, or that the film festival who has like 100 films will somehow make an audience show up. And that's something that like filmmakers really need to have enough resources to execute, because we found that there's only so much you can do on your own. It's a lot of time investment, but the best marketing really begins at the research phase, and the community building has to start there and continue throughout, because then it's authentic engagement, and then people actually want to support the film when it's done. So it's something that should be done in tandem with the making of the film. And if you're not a marketing person or social media person, that's fine. But definitely someone on the team needs to be, or you need to have a budget to hire someone who is. Yeah.
No notes. I don't have anything to add to that. How do you gather good promo assets while you're in production and post?
You just hire someone named Kenya Jade Pinto who does really good set stills.
I have nothing to add.
Also hired.
I also hired her on my last project.
I had I guess any film festival strategies or tips.
Just pay yourself, which is also not a lot of people realize that they can ask for screening fees too. When I first started getting into film festivals, I'd be like just so excited that anybody was screening my work. And then I began to later learn that like bigger distributors were actually asking for screening fees for films. And they're not a lot, but to be honest, for the years after we made our film Scarborough, like doing speaking engagements and asking for screening fees is really what kept me being able to do that. That was important.
That's a good tip. I think one thing that I think about is it's always, if it is possible and it's, in your realm of having a distributor or an EP or just someone on board who's able to like champion your film and give it a little bit of a leg up, that's always helpful when applying to festivals. If not, like having your own, relationship with a programmer or, connecting with them or emailing them can also be helpful. I mean, we're at Real Asian now, so I'm sure they can give you many more tips. But I will say that it's really about finding the journey for your film, because not every film needs to be at, Cannes and TIFF and South by Southwest and like all of these A-list festivals. Like I think sometimes, I've talked to some filmmakers who have shown at a big festival and felt like their film had gotten buried there, and actually found a lot more value in premiering at more community-based, smaller festivals or places that, were actually connecting with their target audience. So I think it's really just, when you start to think about your festival strategy and laying out, that master Google Doc of like however many festivals you're going to be applying for, if that is a part of your strategy, just thinking about, the bigger picture of what that journey will look like for the next, 6 months to a year for your film.
Yeah. To add to that, I think it's so important to sort of kind of ask yourself what does success look like for your film, and really just really think about that question, because I think different films might yield a different answer. But for example, if you're working on a project and it's your first project, maybe the goal is to, it might be that you want to premiere at a big festival, but if you're also just starting out, maybe you just want the people who you're making the film about or the subject matter that you're exploring to have an impact on certain communities. So you might want to make sure, you might want to really think about, well, if that's my goal, how do I line up my festival strategy to serve that goal? Because it might not make sense to maybe like aim for, I mean, it's always great to aim high and see where you'll land, but like thinking about what your why is, what your success metric is, and then sort of using that to sort of shape your festival strategy so that you actually end up with the festival tour that you want, you know? Yeah. Sustainability?
Yeah, I think we have a couple of more minutes before questions. But one question I'd love to throw out to us is how important of a role has mentorship played for y'all? Mentorship and labs, I'll open it up to that.
Oh, Yasmine was asking about sustainability, and then I was like, no one knows the answer to that question. Yes, just kidding. Mentorship. I mean, mentorship has been critical for me. I got a job at a production company, and I worked there for 9 years. And I worked for different producers and different directors. Directors like Nisha Pahuja and like Rama Rao and Angad Bala and Minsuk Lee, and like I got to work with all these directors and learn from them, and producers like Lisa Valencia Svensson and Ed Baraveld, and yeah, it was a huge part of my journey, and also having mentors like Ed who like opened doors and introduced me to people and guided me through a lot of the unknowns of making films for the first time. Yeah, it's been critical for yeah, and it still is critical. Like I've been making docs for 15 years now, and there's still so many unknowns that I'm running into, and it's still really important to have more senior people in your corner. Yeah.
And I just want to shout out Shasha because you are you mentor so many people in your life,
yes.
And I feel like there are probably a handful of people in here that would say that you've been a mentor to them.
1,000%.
And I think it's very integral. Like you're very much in the, headspace of like, people have been there to teach me and I will pass that knowledge down. And yeah, I think that's like such a wonderful quality. And that's like integral feels very doc-like, to be that way. So shout out to you.
Yeah. I feel like I've always wanted to have more mentors, but I don't know that I have had that many tangible mentors, to be honest. I think what's been the most helpful, it's been getting into like labs. And like I think one of the biggest ones for me, especially when I was starting out, was the Breakthrough program, the Doc Institute's Breakthrough program. That was a big one because I think it was a lab that allowed me to, first of all, just like take the time to just focus on my documentary project because I was just sort of nursing it on the side while working a full-time job at the CBC. And so I think to have the dedicated space to really think about your project, to think about how to pitch your documentary film was just really incredibly fundamental. And the other piece of it was the folks that were part of that program with me ended up being part of like my community of people that I still sort of connect with today. And from there, I was able to like, when I would go to Hot Docs, I could like, if I were to go to a networking event, I could spot a couple of those folks that were part of the lab with me and we would navigate it all together. And so I think more than sort of a tangible mentor, I think what's been really helpful in sort of helping me navigate my way through the industry has been going through labs, going through these kinds of programs to connect me with different people. And not just like for my own confidence, but also, for example, in the Breakthrough program, that's also where I was able to meet the broadcaster that ended up greenlighting the project. And so so there's also that sort of industry connection that's able to happen in those kinds of programs. And similar to when I did like the TIFF Writer Studio, the mentors that were able to be there for me in that space, and also the peers that I gained in that program are still super fundamental to sort of my own journey as a filmmaker. So I think more than that, I'm still looking for like a mentor per se, because I'm still making my way and it still feels like a little dodgy, but yeah, still looking for a mentor.
I feel like, and Yaz and I both apply to everything.
Yes.
I always see,
Yes.
I always see you applying for everything and getting into everything. So shout out to you too.
Shoot your shot, always.
An application hates to see you coming, truly. But I will say, what's been really helpful for me with labs, and there's so many of these like cohorts emerging, whatever, like there are so many, and sometimes it's like overwhelming to navigate. But just really, seeing what you need at that time. And for me, it's been really helpful to like go through a lab with a particular project and a very particular goal, and sometimes we'll like apply to something and kind of have like a loose like plan. But I found it the most helpful when I've had like, okay, this is my project. I'm applying to this fund by, end of April. Like I need to get the budget in shape. I literally will like push my project through the lab and utilize all of the resources that it has, all of the mentors that it has, reach out to every mentor, tell them to look over my budget, like see if they'll look over my application, give me notes, like, and use it in the most practical sense. And that's been the most helpful for me, is like having a practical project, and as much as the mentors or folks around or resources are willing to support it, kind of using it in that way, because I found that they're really eager and helpful and have been super supportive.
Yeah. I feel like I've tricked myself where I will like find a lab or find some kind of program and then basically apply to it so that I could force myself to think about my project and use that deadline. Like I have to get this done for this lab. Yeah, scam myself into getting the work done. And honestly, it works. It works because then, my brain's like not really thinking too much about getting it perfect, but getting it done for this deadline. And sometimes when you don't have the sort of like, hard-wired pressure to get your project done and it's just you pushing your bus up a hill, then you kind of need to manufacture it in a way. And I think for me, I've manufactured it through looking for grants, looking for different things and being like, okay, I'm going to apply for this for my project. And then that becomes the deadline that I impose to kind of get a next draft out, get a next whatever out. So far it's working. So we'll see. We'll see.
Cool. Well, thank you for hanging out with us. We have time for some questions as well. What time is it?
Yes.
Sure, I'll start. I'll start on this one. I think every single project has a very different path, and it really has to be tailored to the needs of each of those projects. But it's really just about being creative with the goals of the project and the partners that are in alignment with those goals. So I'm open to any and all kinds of different partnerships. Like sometimes I'll produce something 100% through our company, Compy Films. Sometimes I'll partner with a bigger production company if I know they have greater capacity, access, resources, or something specific to the project. We'll do also international co-productions on one project right now because we are filming in the Philippines. It's a Canada-Philippines co-production. And then also a mix of, if I'm a director, sometimes I'll own my project and or co-own it through my company. And then sometimes on projects I care a little less about, it might just be another production company owns it and I'm a for hire type of director. So it's just, it's thinking about the different types of models and then also the different types of partners. So for some projects, I might know it's like a community driven project. And so it's okay if it goes direct to audience via some platform. And others, it's like, maybe we want people across Canada to watch it on the CBC. Or maybe, there might be some projects that are more international where it's like, we're going directly to Netflix in the US because we want it to have that kind of international, bigger partnership from right off the bat and not just be a Canadian project. So each project really has its own path, and it does require a little bit of knowledge of the landscape. And then sometimes people do creative things where you're like, that's an interesting way. I didn't know they funded it that way. So yeah, hope that answers the question. Do you guys have anything to add?
Sure.
So my question is back to getting eyeballs onto your project. I'm sure a lot of people have a seed, an idea, but everyone's trying to get it seen. So can you kind of maybe go back to a time when you were very junior and how did you get that project seen? Do you just do trailers? Do you do festivals, right? Mm-hmm. But as someone who's very junior, you might not have access to distribution or those connections. How would you approach it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think festivals are definitely a great way to get kind of your foot in the door, especially starting to create those relationships with other filmmakers, with other producers, with distributors that maybe are at the festival that are looking, that are kind of seeing who the new up and coming filmmakers are. And that's been a really helpful way for me to just kind of be connected in the community too, because a lot of times this work can feel, independent, and a lot of times you're at home by yourself in front of a computer, but it's just nice to tap into a network of people. So I feel like festivals, kind of can, depending on the festival, they can even the playing field a little bit and at least be in the same room with a lot of those folks that you would be pitching to, that maybe you sending a cold email to them might not, it might get lost in their inbox, but having a face in front of them and being able to meet you in person might kind of, feel more human. And particularly there are a lot of great festival initiatives nowadays, and what are they called? Different cohorts. And, there's one at Berlinale with the market. There's a lot of markets for these festivals that you can apply to participate in and get a badge and all that sort of stuff. And there are a lot of funding that you can apply for to cover the costs, the travel costs, as well as the badge costs for it. And actually go to these festivals and meet those folks. So I feel like that's been, at least for me, a helpful way to get my foot in the door. But
yeah, I think for me, my first feature, one of ours was also my first film. And so I think what worked really well for me was that we partnered with a documentary channel because they invested into the project from development and production. And so, and part of that partnership meant that when the film would be out, they would we would create sort of digital pieces to sort of write about different elements around the film. And I think that was part of a way that we were able to market the film. But I also remember that, we released the film in 2021. It was a crazy time and not a lot of people were buying a lot of projects. And so it was really scary. I remember also getting, they're like, oh, maybe I remember getting an advice from someone at the Berlin, because I did the EFM Berlinale, and then they were like, maybe you should shelve your project for a year and then next year might be better. And then it's you don't know what you're gonna do because you don't know what world we're gonna live in. So it's kind of it was just a tricky, crazy time. But what ended up happening, we were really lucky that the film ended up getting bought by AMC Plus in the US. So it ended up being available in the US through AMC Plus, which you can access through Apple TV, Amazon Prime. But they bought it, and then by the time it also landed on Sundance TV, which was all great things, but they didn't put a lot of marketing into it. So it happened, and then I remember being like, we got to tell people. And then all we could really do was just put a social media post being like, hey, it's on there. And that's it. And then the distributors ended up, I think they did like one interview on some podcast, and where someone did a review of the film, great review, but we didn't even know it was out. And it was like, it happened in the corner of the internet. And that was that. So it's hard also once you make a thing, you spend all your time and your energy to make a thing. And then once it gets into the distribution stage, it can sometimes sort of like kind of die on their shelves. And so I think we have to think creatively about how we market our projects. I think it does break my heart that I feel like Canada doesn't put enough money and investments into the marketing and distribution of its films and filmmakers. But yeah, that's like an infrastructural question that I hopefully will be able to move towards something better. But yeah, that's all I got.
Yeah, like something I found helpful is kind of to piggyback on existing communities, right? Like to start a community from scratch is like a lot of work and maybe a full-time job for somebody else. But if you can find like a way to piggyback on existing communities through reciprocal relationships, so, partnering with those existing communities, maybe your film tackles some subject matter that there's a huge NGO or not-for-profit or working on those issues. Like you can find a way for the relationship to be reciprocal. So you're not just asking them, hey, can you promote my movie? It's like a relationship, and it can start from the beginning when you're making the film too. So that has been a really key thing for a lot of the projects. And I've also had projects that just go up on like CBC Jam and like a cricket like sees it, like nobody, so it's also having a very experimental mindset about trying different things, right? Like once upon a time, my partner Rich and I, Reddit was a time. Reddit was a thing, and we got like millions of views on trailers and fan trailers by using Reddit. Unfortunately, those days are over, and the social media landscape is chaotic. But there are ways, and people will find ways to break through, and it's all just about tinkering and trying and being like, oh, let's try this, let's see if it does anything, and that's how we have to be right now, because it's a little challenging. Yeah.
And one other thing I wanted to add was, finding those champions for your film. Like, I think when I think about like an EP who maybe like wants to support you in some way, or that you can look at as, maybe they've done a body of work that you really admire, or you really like the way that they've released films, like it doesn't hurt to try and reach out and see if they would put their name on your film, And I think especially when you're emerging, you don't want to give up, really much for that. But if they're willing to help you and kind of just put their name on your film, or help you navigate, those conversations with distributors that maybe you don't have yet. I've seen that happen quite often, and to great levels of success. And also just like you said, like it's not linear too. Like, a few weeks ago, me and a director were like flyering for our film at a film festival. And we were just like laughing at the fact that we were like flyering like it was the early 2000s on like in Club District or something. So it's hard for everyone. One more question.
This is kind of during when you're interviewing your subject. If you have a subject who is maybe really nervous and speaking really fast and kind of stumbling over their words, what would you do to kind of manage that situation and make them feel more comfortable and slow down and be present with you?
That's a hard one. I think it depends on sort of what my relationship is to that participant. but I would try to maybe have conversations with them outside of the interview, just to kind of, let them know like, hey, feel free to like, like slow down just a little bit. I think I've done it before in some interviews where I'll ask them to sort of, basically repeat what they just said, but just a little bit slower. And I think the more you sort of direct them and they realize that you prefer them sort of slowing down in their answers, then I think they're able to sort of like pick it up a little bit, because I think they want to look good too, and they want to be good on camera. And so yeah, I think it's just a matter of sort of directing them to slow down however they can. But sometimes, I don't know that particular participant, so they might have, I don't know, different like health things that might make them maybe feel a bit more anxious. So I think you could also try to be a bit more creative with creating some kind of environment that maybe makes them a little bit more comfortable, so they don't feel like they have to talk. But it's like that, like very fast. But yeah, does that help? I don't know what I just said. Okay.
Yeah, I think everything that Yaz said. I think also with those types of situations, when an interview is not going well, or like maybe not just not going well, but yeah, you can tell maybe that your participant is a little bit uncomfortable or nervous. It's a lot of times it's like about what are all like the little decisions that lead up to the moment where you actually start filming. Because you're almost at that point, you're like, you're turning on your psychologist brain and like trying to just get a sense of like where maybe those emotions are coming from. Are they concerned? Is their baby in the next room? Are they nervous about something they have later on that day? Is it a really intense story that they're about to tell that they're like, maybe there's some fear coming up for them? There's so many kind of questions that you can start to ask, kind of from almost like a therapy perspective. Of like, okay, let's take a second. Like, you can always take a break, try and like, cater to their needs in that moment. Maybe they need some silence. Maybe they need some reassurance. Maybe, just try and figure out what they need, and creating the most comfortable environment for them. But sometimes it takes a few interviews. Like sometimes you won't get it on the first time. And you'll have to kind of get a sense of like why this day isn't working and why you need to go back another day, or try something new, maybe go outside, maybe switch up the vibe. So all you can really do in those moments is like try and get to the root of what the issue is and try and, you kind of just like start to investigate. Yeah.
Yeah. I would also add, sometimes it could be a comfort thing where I remember playing around with like, once we're locked and ready, just maybe have a moment where I'm like, okay, less people in the room. So I'll just kick people out so that there's like, maybe it's just 3 people in the room while we're doing the interview. That way it feels less jarring. And sometimes it's like, let's try to light the room or light the interview in a different way without like a bright light in their face, like, and trying to get creative with that and see how much that helps them feel a little bit more at ease in terms of their conversation. And so, yeah, just getting creative.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I think that's it.